Slavery is a major fact in human history. It is not a finished fact. Slavery has been never in history as prevalent as it is today. This is the greatest age of history, in all of history, for slavery. Before we analyze this prevalence of slavery in the modern world, let us first of all define slavery. The classic definition, the most accurate as given by John Murray, is that slavery is property in the labor of another man. Now there are three main forms of slavery, and it is important to distinguish these three, all of which involve property in the labor of another man. Notice the distinction says property in the labor of another man rather than property in a man, because absolute ownership of another man is an impossibility. You cannot command his thoughts. You may have him under your dominion, but his mind is still free to think alien or hostile thoughts. So that what you command is his labor, and therefore an accurate definition requires this qualification, that slavery is property in the labor of another man. Now, of the three forms of slavery, the first is what people usually think of when the word slavery is used. But actually, it is the most benign form of slavery, and that is private ownership. Private ownership is still in existence in some parts of the world. It is not too widely prevalent. It has never been the major form. The Bible does not issue an absolute condemnation of private ownership of slaves. Instead, it regards it as an inferior way of life, but as a fact of life that some people are going to be slaves. And what it does is to regulate slavery. Now, the slavery of the Old Testament is different from what most people associate with slavery, and some have even called it a form of bond service rather than slavery. But the Bible calls it slavery. One thing that characterized the biblical law was that man-stealing, kidnapping for purposes of enslavement, was strictly forbidden and punishable by death. We find this condemnation, for example, in Deuteronomy 24:7 and elsewhere, and it is repeated in 1 Timothy 1:10. Moreover, the slave, if he did not like the circumstances, unless his situation was one of debt, could leave his master, and the runaway had full freedom, and anyone had the right to give him refuge or to take him in. So that slavery was to a very great extent voluntary. Slavery was strictly regulated by a number of laws, and humane treatment required. But more than that, let us turn to the nature of slavery. How did a man in the Old Testament become a slave? First, he became a slave if he were unable to make a go of it independently, and he wanted the security of working with someone who had means and could provide for him. And so he sold himself into service. This was voluntary. He could leave at the end of every 6 years, the sabbatical year, if he so chose. Foreigners could leave in the Jubilee year, so that his slavery was not permanent. Even those who refused to leave in the sabbatical year and chose to remain on as slaves and had their ears bored to indicate that they were a member of the household and found their security in the door or refuge place of the master, even they on the Jubilee year were released. Now, the other kind of slave was the thief. A thief had to restore whatever he stole plus the same amount which he hoped to gain, so that if he stole $100, he had to restore that $100 plus another 100, the amount he expected to gain. In the case of livestock, the restitution had to be fourfold or fivefold because there was a substantial increase with livestock. Now, If the thief were unable to make restitution, he was sold and his services were to be in payment, either directly to the owner or from the buyer to the owner of the property he stole for compensation. This was private ownership of slaves. It was a thoroughly humane institution, very carefully regulated by law. As we turn to other forms of private ownership of slaves, the most common variety that meets the eye is that which prevailed in the American South. Here we have been subjected to a great deal of mythology. It is easy when you deal with any people or person or institution to go through their history and cull out everything that might be derogatory, and when you deal with an incident to give it a one-sided interpretation and condemn the institution thereby. But this is not historiography. This is propaganda. And this is using a partial truth to tell a lie. The Africans who were brought here moved from one form of slavery, which was particularly severe, to a milder form in this country. They were slaves owned by their chiefs in Africa. And the economic unit of exchange, the money of Africa, was slavery. Slaves were what they made all payments with. Thus, the Negroes moved from a very severe form of slavery to a very mild one in this country. As we read the accounts of slavery, we are told of the horrors of the slave ship. And it is true that there were several very ugly episodes in which quite a large number of slaves died because of overcrowding. This we cannot overlook. But when we have said that, we must point out that most slave traders were dealing with expensive merchandise that they were going to sell. They hoped to profit by it, and it was up to them to take care of the goods until it reached the market. So that these particular slave ships that were especially bad were not representative. Moreover, when we compare the slave ships to the immigrant ships, we find that the slave ships and the immigrant ships come off about equally as well. In fact, a member of a legislative commission from Canada in 1857, reporting on the emigration of the Irish to the Americas, Canada in particular, said that the slave ships and the immigrant ships were about equal. That there was little provision for food and water on the ships that brought the Irish to this country. And the Irish came over here, moreover, without any means, often with barely enough clothing to cover them because they were escaping from famine in the old country. And their condition on reaching New York or Toronto or Boston was often far worse than that of the slaves, and their condition after they arrived, since they had no one to provide them lodging or food, was far worse.